Hi, this is Dr. Jason Johnson. Hello. I have to thank everybody. The YouTube has been blowing up. If you're watching this on Instagram, it's only going to run for about a minute, and then you got to run over to my YouTube. Thank you all so much. The support has been fantastic. We broke 1 million views last week. Like, I just started this 2 weeks ago, broke 1 million views on the YouTube site. So very much thank you, everybody. Please like, subscribe, and share these videos. Like I said, this is Dr. Jason Johnson. This is where, on my YouTube, is where I can go in depth on subjects. Instagram is more breaking news, blue sky, whatever, but this is where I can go in depth on issues and talk about things extensively. And so today, today, we're going to talk a little bit about Shannon Sharpe. I know that may seem strange, but trust me, I'm not interested in gossip. I'm not interested in nonsense. I'm interested in having a discussion about the inflection point that we are at as a culture as this story moves forward. So, as I usually say, this is 3 things by Jason Johnson. First, we're going to talk about what's the inflection point that we're actually at, that this is a story. 2, we're going to talk about how we really should discuss these things. And then 3, I have a conversation that I want to bring you about MAGA and kids. So let's start off, because this is kind of a key thing. I'm going to say a couple things up front because I think they're very important to say for truth, honesty, justice, and the whole thing. I don't know Shannon Sharpe. I consume his content like other people. I'm like the 45 million people who watch the Cat Williams interview. I've seen some of his work. I sometimes see him on First Take. That is the extent to which I know him. I've never worked with him, nothing else like that. Number 2, and I think this is super duper important to say, I am not a lawyer, so I'm not interested. I think it's kind of crazy that you got people. This always happens when there's a potential scandal. People are sitting there and speculating, well, I think this, I think that. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I think it's a cop-out to say we weren't there, but I am not a lawyer. I don't know what the actual legal things are. But what I do know is this, and what I do know why this is important. 1, let's not pretend that this isn't trending information, right? The number 1 trending thing on Google is actually news. It is something that is affecting our society. It's affecting how conversations work. So people can sit there and poo-poo all they want about, well, this isn't technically news. Yes, it is. These things actually matter. What trends, whether you're talking about tariffs, whether you're talking about HBCUs, whether you're talking about a story with a very prominent individual, they drive the conversations we're having as a culture. So to pretend that it's not something to be discussed is crazy. But this is why this is important. This is point number 1. This is an inflection point. How the public responds to this is going to be an inflection point. What do I mean by that? As much as I hate the phrase, I am old enough to remember like Gary Hart. I remember Gary Hart when I was a kid. He was a presidential candidate. He was a Democrat. He got in trouble for having an affair. When I was a kid, I remember prominent men, you could lose your entire career off just the accusation of an affair, right? Just the accusation of cheating. You could lose your career or you could be suspended for some extended period of time. And then around the 90s, right, with Bill Clinton, that kind of changed. I mean, it was known that Bill Clinton had plenty of extramarital affairs when he got elected in 1992. And then you move to the end of Bill Clinton's career in 1998 when you had the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And not only did it not really harm him, the Democrats actually did really, really well in midterm races in 1998. And Bill Clinton remained a beloved political cultural figure for like the next 25 or 30 something years, right? Well, not 30 years from there, but you get my point, right? And then we moved into kind of a different space, and a space where when you talk about accusations and scandal and everything else like that, sort of leading into Donald Trump getting elected and Me Too, and why that relates to someone like Shannon Sharpe and professional athletes and entertainers, right? The cause of Me Too was essentially Donald Trump, right? You had a man who got elected despite dozens of accusations of sexual assault and abuse, dozens going back to his ex-wife, right? And who was caught on tape bragging about sexually assaulting women. And even though he got elected, you had a large number of people in the culture. There was a cultural inflection point where people were like, whoa. Maybe this guy got into office, but as a culture, we're going to push back on this. And that's where you got the Me Too movement. And that's where you got Harvey Weinstein getting in trouble. And that's where you got Kevin Spacey getting in trouble. And that's where you got Bill Cosby getting in trouble. And all of these people who were not just accused of multiple inappropriate things that they had done and assaults against women, but also just harassing people and being unpleasant and using their power as men to take advantage of women. So the reason I mention all that is because this is a new inflection point, right? Donald Trump just got reelected. So everybody knew all these scandals. They knew about Stormy Daniels. And when the president gets reelected, it changes the culture. He has an administration with people like Corey Lewandowski, Pete Hegseth, people who have been accused of harassment, abuse, assault, and mistreatment of women over and over and over again, and yet they're still in power. So the question is, what is the public's attitude and appetite for this kind of scandal anymore? Are we now a public that will look at what has happened, these accusations? Again, all we know are accusations about Shannon Sharpe, and will it cost him his career? I'm willing to speculate it won't. I think we've passed the Rubicon here. I think we're at a point where, as a culture, you have so many people in power who have been accused, and in some cases, in a court of law, proven to have engaged in much worse activity. I think we've reached a point where accusations alone don't seem to affect powerful people the way they used to. I'm not saying that's good, because I don't think that anyone, man, woman, regardless of sexuality, should lose their job over accusations. But I also know, and I have been around long enough to see that that has actually happened. I also think that we're in a society where when people make a lot of money, even when you take race into consideration, you can oftentimes get away with behavior that might otherwise not be acceptable to people. And again, I don't know what Shannon Sharpe has or has not done, but I know that if somebody was willing to pay this individual $50 million, they very likely think they make $200 million off of him. And it's interesting when you get into the idea of race and athletics, because there have been many professional athletes, Ben Roethlisberger first comes to mind, who have been accused of inappropriate behavior and assault, et cetera, and it never ends up affecting their career one way or another. And we're oftentimes upset with that, but the market, more than our morality, determines whether or not somebody faces consequences. I hope that justice is served. I hope that whatever the truth is comes out in this instance. But more importantly, I hope that as a society and a culture, as we see this case go forward, if it actually ends up being investigated as opposed to random leaks and information, I hope we as a culture look at ourselves and say, okay, what's okay with us? What's it okay for somebody to be accused of? What's it okay for somebody to not be accused of? And what line, racially and culturally, do we draw where we say, this is believable, this is not believable, and regardless of what this person has done, we're going to hold them accountable by no longer consuming what they do. Again, it seems to me that we have reached a point where that's not the case, given who's in the White House, given the success of people like Chris Brown, given the fact that you still have people sort of rooting for R. Kelly despite the fact that he's in jail. The second thing is this, and this is really important because I sort of talked about how this is covered. First, my comment is how we treat this as a society, but second, how it's covered. I keep saying this because I'm going to keep banging this drum forever. I wish we had better news coverage. I do. I think that when you have a prominent entertainer that is accused of things that are pretty heinous, right? And there's audio and we don't have anything else like that. There was a time where you had dedicated court TV, as you had dedicated news coverage of actual experts who could talk to the public about it. We can't pretend that people aren't talking about it. That's the thing. You can't pretend that's not news. It's just as important. Bill Cosby was the same way. Bill Cosby was an important point of discussion, but you had more journalists at the time investigating Bill Cosby, investigating whether they thought it was right or wrong. Some people think Bill Cosby didn't do anything. Some people think Bill Cosby got what he deserved. There was a whole documentary, We Have to Talk About Bill Cosby. It is news. It is important. And how we decide that we're going to behave as a society speaks volumes about the world that we're going to live in moving forward, right? The one thing I will say is this. It is always very interesting to me that in a society that often has very extreme judgments one way or another about how people operate in their personal lives, sexual lives, and everything else like that, I think the one thing that everybody is universally agreed upon is that the age gap makes a lot of people uncomfortable, regardless of what the circumstances are. I think that's probably the one universal. Other than that, we don't know. But I hope we as a society make a collective decision, and a better decision than we made with Trump, and a better decision than we made in some other instances. What do we find acceptable? What do we not find acceptable? And are we not willing to jump to judgment just because there are pre-existing stereotypes and racial narratives that always make it convenient to have a conversation one way or another? I don't know. I hope for the best. I hope that there is true adjudication in this and that is not purely on social media, but I don't control that. Just like I didn't control it 40 years ago when somebody was getting rid of Gary Hart, just like I didn't control it with Bill Clinton. I don't like a world where people make judgments based on random information, but I do like a world where we seem to have a certain cultural standard about what we do think is appropriate or not appropriate given actual real evidence. That's my number 2. Now my number 3, which I just want to say kind of quickly because I think this sort of connects. There's this interesting thing that's happened to me a day or so ago. I was going out to lunch with a friend of mine, and we went to Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria, and I saw a number of young white men and some potentially racially ambiguous men, high school kids, wearing MAGA hats. And they were on a field trip for some school. They were all wearing red, but it turned out that it was like a Christian school they were on a field trip on. And I'm going to say this because it's a naive thing that I think a lot of people say that it's time that we dispense from our logic. I don't know any school, religious or otherwise, that should be allowing kids to wear MAGA hats. I wouldn't. You know, if I were a teacher, I'd be like, hey, take that hat off. That can be your politics, but you're not going to wear a hat in school. But these kids were clearly allowed to walk around Old Town Alexandria wearing their MAGA hats, where there were other kids in their class who were not wearing their hats. But for those of us who think, and I've talked about this in other places, how what we're dealing with now is not going to disappear anytime soon, I'm going to be honest with you. For those of us who think that any of this is going to be over in a 2026 election or a 2028 election, know that that is not true. You have a generation of young people of all colors who are absolutely, especially young men, who are wedded to this MAGA movement. It is a cult for them. It is not something that's going to change. They are galvanized by conflict. They're galvanized by anything that allows them under any and all circumstances to be angry or hateful or dismissive of women or dismissive of other communities. And that's not going to change with a couple of votes. That's only going to change when we as a society set standards and consequences financially as far as what we consume, what we accept, and what we're happy with, and tell young men like that, hey, you can have whatever politics you want, but supporting a president who is in favor of white nationalists, et cetera, and questioning the legitimacy of autism, that's not cool, even if you're just wearing a hat to troll. But apparently their parents and teachers don't think about that. So anyway, that's 3 things tonight. Thanks so much. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'll be posting this today. Thank you all so much for getting us up to 1 million. I'll see you for the next 1 million. It's Jason Johnson.